Welcome to Snow Talk, the podcast series that brings you in-depth interviews for an insider's look at what makes our industry work. We will be speaking with snow industry professionals about life, about business and leadership in this often challenging and always satisfying industry. This episode of Snow Talk is brought to you by Fisher Engineering. And now, enjoy Snow Talk, sponsored by Fisher.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Snow Talk, the podcast of SIMA, the Snow and Ice Management Association. I'm your host, Martin Tirado, the CEO of SIMA, and I'm excited to discuss the current state of salt applicator legislation today. There's been exciting activity in this area, both historically and in the state of New Hampshire, which created the first legislation in North America for salt applicators. Also, currently, there is pending legislation in the state of Wisconsin that largely replicates New Hampshire. Our two subject matter experts and our guests today, they've been leaders in salt applicator legislation and training. The first one I'd like to introduce is Ted Deers. He is the Assistant Director, Water Division for the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. And then we also have Allison Madison. She's a Program Manager of Wisconsin Saltwise. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us, Martin.
No problem. Yeah, so a little background on salt applicator legislation was it started really kind of New Hampshire 10 years ago, and they were on the leading edge, and Ted was a part of that. And from the snow and ice management side of it, the snowplow contractors, which is what SIMA represents, for us, we were always intrigued by adding some kind of liability protection for trained applicators. And that kind of would go hand in hand with making sure that there wasn't over-application of chlorides on paved surfaces, which did seem to be the runoff from that, did seem to be the contamination of freshwater sources was the initial reason to create salt applicator legislation. But to kind of go a little bit back, that I did want to start a little bit on the science and the data behind chloride contamination. And I want to just talk about kind of like the data that's out there that shows that water sources are being contaminated from salt, specifically when snow and ice melting is occurring from being applied on paved surfaces. And can that be pinpointed directly towards winter services? So, Ted, I'd like to have you answer this question first, since New Hampshire has been really a leader on this and the Green Snow Pro legislation, the training for 10 years. But kind of going back roughly 10 years, and maybe even it goes back a little further than that, but how did chloride contamination get brought to the attention of your department in New Hampshire?
Thanks, Martin. It's great to be able to kind of go back through the history of how we got here as a state. So we've had a very strong tradition of volunteer monitoring in our state for 30 years or so. So we've been watching chloride levels, and especially we have a lot of loggers out there, data loggers for specific conductivity, watching specific conductivity rise in certain, especially urbanized watersheds. Specific conductivity measures all kinds of things in the water, but especially things like chlorides that are good conductors. So this got heated to a point. We've been watching this for a while, but really it's the early 2000s, 2004, that this took off here. Where this kind of came to bear was that our Department of Transportation was looking to expand a highway in the southern part of the state, Interstate 93, which connects Boston, the greater Boston metropolitan area, to the ski areas and the lakes of New Hampshire, which is really that winter and summer playground for a lot of folks from Massachusetts and Connecticut, Rhode Island. And so as they were looking to double the size of the highway, there was some data that was collected in that area. And these are some of the most urbanized areas of New Hampshire, and they identified some very high levels of chlorides in some of the small streams, rivers that were in the area, specifically in those areas that were going to get more highway. This then created an issue related to the water quality certification that this project needed, because it had a lot of wetland impacts, which stimulated the need for water quality certification, which is more than you wanted to know about the Clean Water Act, but that it essentially situation where we had to understand how much salt was out there. We had to look at how much should there be out there to actually meet water quality standards, and what would you have to do to reduce. That really, in that exercise, started us down a whole series of adventures that have led us to where we are today.
So how did you, just kind of curious again, how did you kind of pinpoint it that chloride application, rock salt, used in winter services was one of the contaminating factors in fresh water?
That's a great question. And we get this a little bit, but one of the things that's interesting about New Hampshire, a little different from the Midwest, is that we truly have almost no other sources of chloride. So
Okay.
granite, we sit on granite. There's really no sources within that. We don't have water softeners because we already have soft water. We do have wastewater treatment plants, obviously, but those have very low chloride levels that come out of them. And we have septic systems around certain areas, certainly, that put septic into the groundwater. But again, very, very small. And so one of the things that we did as part of what's called the TMDL, a total maximum daily load, which is basically a salt budget, the chloride budget that we needed to do in order for the permits to go forward on the highway. When we did those calculations, we did what's called a mass balance. And so we looked at how much salt was in the water and so then distributed that on the landscape as to where that could actually be coming from. And 95% of it is coming from road runoff from winter maintenance. The interesting thing about that is that it's not always runoff at sort of winter, at the end of winter or during winter. We actually, in some areas, saw our highest chloride levels, concentrations, in the middle of summer. And that's really all of that runoff during the winter, sitting in groundwater. The groundwater goes down in the summer. It starts to come out into the streams, and you get these very high levels in the streams. So we have a really good understanding, not just that this is rock salt, not just that this is coming from snow and ice, but in terms of who's responsible. We actually were able to do some mass balance as to the application rates on the highways, the application rates for other municipalities by looking at how much they use, and then being able to attribute how much of this is to the private sector. And probably to no one's surprise, it was a bit of a surprise at the time because people were pointing their finger at the big DOT and the big bad DPWs, is that more than 50% was coming from the private sector and from those parking lots, driveways, and
Yeah.
snow and ice professionals.
That seems very thorough and a good explanation on that. That kind of actually segues well into Allison talking to you about Wisconsin, because I know Wisconsin, being a fellow Wisconsinite, suburban Milwaukee, I know you're in the Madison area, is sometimes I do hear from in Wisconsin, the chloride contamination in freshwater sources is from water softeners. It's from maybe factory runoff, dairy farm runoff from whatever's used in processing of dairy farms. But what happened in the state of Wisconsin where they kind of found that some of it in chloride contamination was coming from winter services, rock salt being applied?
Thank you, Martin. So I guess I do want to note that, we talk a lot about chlorides and salt, the salt we put down on parking lots, as well as the salt that we eat. Most of the time we're talking about sodium chloride. And we tend to focus more on the chloride piece of that because that moves really readily through the soils and then ends up in our water. But sodium is also something we want to think about, especially as the amount of it is increasing in our drinking water. So I might sometimes just say salt instead of chloride because we're seeing both of those levels go up. But yeah, so sources of salt, as you mentioned, in Wisconsin, we see salt from water softeners, especially in southern Wisconsin to southeastern, eastern Wisconsin, where we have limestone bedrock. There are some salts, potassium chloride in our fertilizers. You also mentioned, some food. So not necessarily from the dairy farms that much, but from the production of that milk into cheese. Cheese brine has salt, producing sauerkraut. So some industrial food, salt is making its way into our streams as well because wastewater treatment plants cannot remove that salt. But to dig into how do we know that winter salt use is a contributor, I would say the first city, Madison, as you mentioned, where I am at right now, the capital, when the city decided to start using salt on their roads, their common council said we should maybe take a look at what's going on in our lakes. And as early as the 1960s, they were actually collecting data and they started seeing the chloride, again, the focus on chloride levels climb. And by the 1970s, the Common Council was saying, maybe we should reduce the amount of salt we're putting down on our roads. And they did work to do that for at least a few years, and then it just started climbing up again. So I'd say that, early data collection was there were only a few people kind of really paying attention to those numbers. And folks in public health, they didn't necessarily have a big loudspeaker. There weren't a ton of people listening to them as they said that maybe we should think about doing something differently. But in the 2000s, Ted, I know mentioned kind of like, early 2000s, 2010, we started to see some research data published that looked a lot at what was happening in the Milwaukee area and different metropolitan areas across the US, but especially in Milwaukee. Data was published, and this was through the USGS, that showed our chloride levels had risen from naturally in Wisconsin to be between 0 and 10 milligrams per liter is the unit there. So between 0 and 10. In the Madison Lakes, those had been climbing into the 10s, 20, 30, 40, 50. And then in Milwaukee, when they began to take samples in the wintertime and also try to monitor, like Ted mentioned, this conductivity. It's kind of a proxy for chloride. You can use it, if you do some testing, use it as a way to understand sodium and chloride levels. And those levels were going up into the thousands, even 10,000 milligrams per liter of chloride. So they really did have the ability at that point, when you see these spikes happening in the winter during snowmelt events, to say, yeah, like the source here is winter salt that's gone down on roads, parking lots. It's turned that snow salty. And when it washes into our streams, we're seeing these huge, what they call kind of loading events, right? Just like immense amounts of salt melting off into the streams.
Okay, that's a great explanation. Good history as well, too. So, Ted, I'm going to go really fast through New Hampshire because I recall how it went through, the legislature pretty quickly in some committees. And let's just put it, New Hampshire decided that they're going to create a training and certification program that's going to, legislate and provide some regulation for salt applicators. So that's been in existence, that got approved, been in existence for 10 years. It's called the Green Snow Pro. I'm just curious as to what do you think of the program as being part of it? Maybe you'll be biased, of course, but do you think it's working? And I guess the sense is working. There's a few things, and it comes down to, do you think that people are, salt applicators are open to the training and learning that's needed and the documentation in the Green Snow Pro program? And then also, has it shown that there's some kind of a reduction in salt contaminating freshwater surfaces? Is it in freshwater sources? Is it decreasing compared to where it was prior? Just kind of give me your thoughts on, now that you've had this program for 10 years, again, what's working well?
So I've thought about this on this question about a lot. And it's a really hard question to answer. And I'm going to answer it in a number of different ways. First of all, the point of the program is obviously to get people to use less salt. I mean, that is kind of the underlying point. And I'd like to end with that.
Yeah.
What it's been really successful at is getting people to want to be trained. So I think that if you look at the amount of training, the amount of certifications that we've done, we've trained thousands of people in the state. We've certified hundreds and certified thousands of people in the state. We have people that come in and out. It's a very transient industry. So you have people coming in and out of the industry all the time, and they're getting certified. They're going to the classes. Our program started actually before we had the legislation. We had a voluntary program similar to Minnesota. In fact, we just stole Minnesota's program and used it. Thank you, Minnesota. And so, that I think has been very successful, and we hear back from people. One of the things that people have to do as part of their certification is they have to report their amounts of salt. And they report that by tons of salt and the area, the square footage that they actually apply on. and they can report it as rock salt, or there as other salts, calcium chloride and potassium chloride, or whatever else they're using, mag. So whatever they're using, they can report that, and they also report the square footage in which town they're in. What we've been able to understand is if you look back at people who've been actually certified, our certification program actually goes back almost to 2008, 2009 with some of the companies. If you look at the companies that have been in this for a long time, and especially parse them out between larger companies and smaller companies, but mostly really looking at the numbers, the companies that have been with the program for a long time, their reported salt usage, as a rate, as an amount of salt per square foot, has gone down over time. So that's pretty impressive. And, from the data that we have, which is, pretty rough data, we can actually tease that out, and we can actually see a pretty clear indicator that they're using less. We also have tons and tons of anecdotal evidence talking with the contractors about how much salt that they've saved, as well as municipalities, talking to the municipalities that have done a good job on this. So that seems to be working. The other thing that's working is the limited liability relief appears to be starting to work. That is, if you get sued, and the way that the limited liability is supposed to work, that is if you're sued for a slip and fall, you were using best management practices, the answer is you were not negligent, and you were certified, that case should essentially be thrown out once they sort of realize everyone was, you weren't negligent. So if you kind of go through this, these cases should be thrown out. So we just had a lawsuit that went through that tested that, and it came through. We actually, the liability provision went through a jury trial, came out the other end as being something that should be used and holds up in court. That's great. The case was dismissed. So that's a success. Now, are we actually reducing the amount of chlorides in the environment is an enormous undertaking. And one
sure
issue is that I mentioned that a lot of our highest levels come out in groundwater. Groundwater can take 5 years, 2 years, 1 year, 10 years, depending on what the media is, to work its way out. So the salt that we see in our rivers today is a reflection of land use 5 to 10 years ago. So even if you are reducing now, it takes a while for that to show up in these really large data sets. So I think that that's a really challenging piece. The other piece is, do we have critical mass? There's lots of applicators. Are we hitting enough of them? Are there enough of them doing these practices? And then let's not even talk about what the demands are of the property owners themselves, who want to feel the crunch under their feet. So those are all the factors that I think are complicated.
Yeah, there are a few. I'm glad you mentioned those. There is that thought out there that the crunch under the boots or shoes leads to more safe conditions, and that's a myth. The other part of it too is there's more paved surfaces now. The population of the United States is growing; it's not shrinking. That usually means there's more development. When you have more development, there's more buildings that are going to have paved surfaces that need a number of things, but they're going to need snow and ice removal. So there could be generally increased application just from more development and population base. So that's out there too, where it gets complicated. But I do think that was a great synopsis. I didn't want to just maybe talk real quickly about getting certified, because sometimes there's a little bit of a perception that it's challenging, it's onerous, it's too complicated, whatever. But I actually think the Green Snow Pro is pretty simple for a company to become certified. So let's say, for example, I'm a snow and ice contractor. I own a company, and we want to get Green Snow Pro certified. Real briefly, what are the steps that I would need to take to do that in New Hampshire?
Yeah. Toronto's 2 guys in a plow.
Right. Yep.
They want to get certified, so they would have to sign up for a class. It's a 6-hour course. Sorry, a 4-hour course. You have to do the full 4-hour course. And after you've done that first class, you keep track that you went through it. And if you had any subordinates, the people who are driving for you, if you're the owner, they would have to get trained as well. And then you submit that documentation along with an application and a fee. It's a relatively small fee, probably a couple of $100 for Toronto plowing. And they would, and basically you're certified. Now, the trick is remaining certified. This is where you have to get retrained every 6 years, and you have to get refresher courses every 2 years. So you have to go through that process as well during that time period. And you have to report your annual applicator, your application and your application rates. Where did you plow? All of that stuff. But most importantly, if you ever get sued, what you have to do is you have to be able to produce the documentation that you actually did what you were supposed to do on those particular storms, on those particular days. You don't give that to the state. You keep that. You keep that in case you ever get sued. So that's the more complicated part, is that you should be doing that anyway in case you get sued. But if you want to, have that, both the certification that is what you've done for the state, as well as get that limited liability relief, you also have to do that good documentation on your own side. It's a very low bar to become certified and stay certified. But in order to get the limited liability relief, you have to make sure you document.
Yeah, good point. There are a lot of software services out there now, too, that do that automated and without so much, I would say, personnel labor, and can save that documentation for long periods of time. So there's solutions out there that are affordable and easily to manage. So I think that's something to kind of point out. We'll switch here, too, then back to Allison and talk a little about Wisconsin. So Wisconsin has this issue that's been identified on salt contamination or chloride contamination in water. And through your work, you wanted to come up with a solution for that. What lent you towards because I've been involved in legislation, myself, and it's replicating New Hampshire. What drew you to looking at New Hampshire as a model program to replicate in Wisconsin?
So I would say that we went that route because of so many conversations with contractors who took, similar to New Hampshire, we have right now we just have a voluntary program. So we do have hundreds of contractors that voluntarily have decided, I want to, take some continuing education around smart salting, best practices. And they'll take these classes and learn about different technologies and the use of brine, anti-icing before the storm or pre-wetting, and get some information on rates. And then they'll say, but wait, we can't really do this, or we can't be that aggressive because, as you guys identified earlier, there's that norm out there right now for a lot of people that you're not safe. Salt hasn't gone down unless you can see it and hear that crunch under your feet. So the contractors really said, we need your support around liability. Until we can work on this barrier, we can only do so much on our own, because the property managers are liable. They're going to give us a call if they don't see salt. So I'd say that was the impetus here. How do we support contractors? And liability was the way.
No, that is good. That's exactly it. We're going to take a quick break to hear from the sponsor of Snow Talk, the podcast, and we will be right back.
When plowing is your profession, it's up to you to keep the world moving through winter's worst. Less time worrying about your equipment is more time for clearing lots. So we'll cut to the chase. Only Western builds efficiency into every feature of our plows and spreaders. With 65 years of experience behind us, we know what it takes to save time and stay profitable. So we make one promise: more jobs done faster.
Welcome back to Snow Talk, the podcast of the Snow and Ice Management Association. We're here with Ted Deers from New Hampshire and Allison Madison from Wisconsin Saltwise, talking about salt applicator legislation. And kind of going back to, we just heard from Allison, but I want to just continue our conversation, Allison. And there's legislation in both the Senate and Assembly in Wisconsin that's, for political reasons right now, is stalled, but it exists and has potential to be passed really kind of at any time. And let's say that does happen. What are you hoping that an outcome of this would be? And what do you think is going to continue to draw demand to have contractors, or really salt applicators, go through the certification and whatever comes out of the legislation requires?
So I think that if this legislation did pass, we'd see an uptick in contractors in our more urban areas of the state get certified, because I think I grew up in rural Wisconsin. My brother's snow removal is done by his buddy. Used to be my grandpa with, the tractor. So in certain parts of the state, we don't have that same sort of litigious kind of culture. But in the areas where we do, in areas where contractors have already potentially every year, had to deal with the headache of lawsuits, I think they are the ones who are going to say, yeah, like, I want to pursue this training that will help support me and reduce this headache that I have to deal with that just sucks time and money, right? Because we know a lot of these lawsuits, it's not necessarily the contractor's fault in any regard, but they're just a really easy target right now. So I think that just certain parts of the state will see people get on board. Some of the larger contractors that maybe deal with more lawsuits will see the benefit of this.
Yeah, great point. We certainly see, and you both discussed it, that it's the liability protection component of it. I know at least in the state of Wisconsin, the public sector is protected through existing laws, the Constitution of Wisconsin. But, the private contractor is not. And having some type of a liability protection through education and certification, we think is really kind of the key to get the private contractor, the typical Simon member involved in this. Ted, you were talking about you don't think it's overly difficult for a company, and Toronto and my 2 trucks to get certified and even remain certified. You're talking about a few $100s. I do think the costs in New Hampshire are very low, because that's something that's kind of come up as a challenge, and just in some legislators' personal opinions, that they want to lower costs for small private businesses because they see that as a regulatory burden that may not be necessary. One of the counter arguments to that, we see is it could lower insurance premiums just by reducing some of these slip and fall claims. And that's a massive savings that we're seeing as increases kind of going up throughout the country. Just from New Hampshire's perspective, I think that the costs are incredibly affordable. Do you think so as well too, especially since you had mentioned earlier, there was a case that went to, so many of these cases get settled prior to going to court because of the cost of litigation. But there was a case that went to was taken up by the New Hampshire Supreme Court, and they found in favor of the defendant, which was the snow and ice company and the property owner, because they had followed the policies and practices that are in the Green Snow program. And we looked at that as that's just a massive success. So I don't know, do you have any thoughts, Ted, on just kind of like the cost of getting it, and then also really what you get as savings beyond that? And you can even touch on, I was even thinking as well too, is just what are you saving on material supplies? If you're doing the same amount of work and getting the same results with less materials, there should be a savings there as well too. But Ted, go ahead. What thoughts did you have on that?
Let me start with just about costs. What we hear from at least the folks who have really engaged in salt reduction is that it totally pays for itself. I mean, that's what we hear all the time. You probably hear that too, because that's, your bread and butter. But absolutely, that's what we hear, is that when you invest in these technologies or these various different, whether it's a plow technology or just best practices, however you're doing that it generally pays for itself, and it pays for itself usually very quickly. I'll tell one little anecdote about a very small town in New Hampshire, poor town in New Hampshire, old mill town kind of thing. That's certainly something Wisconsinites and most of the Midwest can identify with. That, the guys in the DPW really wanted to get a new Bobcat to help them do their work better. And the guy who was their DPW director really wanted to see some salt reduction. And so he talked to his guys, and he's like, look, guys, if we can save $40,000 in salt this year, we can buy that Bobcat that you guys have been wanting. So I'm sending everybody to the salt training, come back with ideas, and let's figure out how to do that. And so they did. They saved enough in their salt budget that they were able to buy that Bobcat. And they, providing public safety and public service. So, I think that it's certainly possible with the right kind of incentives for people to do that. I hesitate to say, and I'm going to be very pessimistic, that anyone will ever save money on insurance ever across anything that we do that requires insurance. But that's sort of the industry. But I would just say that we have insurance companies that are now requiring Green Snow Pro for their clients. We have property management companies, large ones, that will not allow people who are not Green Snow Pro certified to bid on their contracts. We have towns, because they're part of the MS4, the stormwater permits, that now require people who are applying on large parking lots in their towns to actually be Green Snow Pro certified. So there's other ways that this gets woven into the fabric of how these contracts end up getting let and who comes in to do that. I think that the limited liability relief will probably help stabilize the insurance and not have people not be able to get insurance. I think that's the much bigger risk at this point from at least some of the contractors I talk to, is the shrinking pool of insurers for these companies. And I'm hoping that this program would help with some of that.
Great points, Ted. Yeah, I should rephrase that too. It's because you're right. There's just so many factors that go into insurance. I mean, things just cost more in general, and we're right now currently in a hardening insurance market. But I think we're right. The correct term, like you said, is stabilization. So I take a look at, there could be an example of insurance rates that may have gone up 20% for a company. Maybe they'll only go up 10%, 10 to 15, because they have more options, because there's more insurers in the market. There's more best practices and training followed. So that's a great point. Stabilization of rates, I think, is a great way to look at it. Allison, I want to talk to you about just the training that you're doing in Wisconsin. You're doing quite a bit on the public works municipality sector. What's the reaction and feedback that you're getting? Because it seems like the attendance that you're getting at your events are great. That entities in the public sector that don't have the liability limitations or incentives to be safe, to really provide safety and safe services. They're really kind of doing it more for the education side. But just give me a sense of what kind of reaction are you getting from those users and those salt applicators.
Thanks, Martin. And I'm going to sound like a politician. Thanks, Anne. I want to tell you something else first. In Wisconsin, there have actually been some concerns around what Ted mentioned, this fear that, if this liability passes, then am I going to be required to take this test? Is this going to become mandatory to get trained? And I would caution against kind of that fear, because I think, similar to what I said about contractors who see the incentive if they're in an area where there's already a lot of lawsuits, I know that in a lot of places in Wisconsin, property managers have a hard time finding snow removal companies, period, right? And they are not going to want to put more of a burden on companies Yes. So I would say it's only probably going to be in areas where we already see that those lawsuits are happening. So just a word there to kind of temper, I think, maybe, Ted, if that's okay, kind of that comment.
Well, I would always point out, Allison, is that was the fear as well, and why we have a voluntary program. And because people have become so comfortable with the program, it's become less and less of a concern over stuff. So our concern is absolutely well placed, but I think you're exactly right. Let's let this thing evolve Wisconsin style.
So I would say that, yes, in Wisconsin, I am receiving, and I being, the program manager and the main educator through Wisconsin Saltwise, a lot of invitations to come and to do trainings with individual agencies, cities and even counties. And I'd say the real impetus for that is just kind of a lack of other educational opportunities for their staff. And people see that there are changes out there, newer technologies as we, open up this new world of brine. I mean, what additives are you using? What rates are you pre-wetting and anti-icing at? Are you going with, just a simple pre-wet system or a slurry or a shake and bake truck. It's just, there are so many new toys, right, out there to play with. And I think people want to learn from one another. So in addition to trainings, I've had a lot of success, a lot of interest in equipment open houses that I've co-hosted with different agencies. And, people are excited about this, not just because it's new and exciting, but really the dollar savings. And you guys commented on that earlier. If we're over applying salt by 50%, by 100%, right? And then we cut that down, these municipalities are dropping their salt budgets, right? And the cost of salt is only going up, as is the cost of repairing our roads. So I think everybody who works in winter maintenance is far more connected to the damage that salt does than the average citizen, right? Like the corrosion to metal surfaces, to our concretes, to the flooring, vegetation, and all of those repairs are getting also more expensive every year. So it's not just cutting the cost of salt, but also those ongoing repair and equipment costs as well. So the dollar savings, and then additionally, especially, with the use of brine, sometimes better plow blades, we're seeing higher levels of service. So, it's kind of hard to argue with something that's getting, people closer to bare pavement or to bare pavement sooner while using less money. Yeah, it's just really a win-win. I would say there are some capital investment costs to begin with, right? It's not necessarily all these things don't come for free, but people are seeing that return on investment coming within, a season, couple seasons. I read a study, South Dakota DOT bought these new plow blades that were really expensive. They had a second blade, like a squeegee, rubberized blade behind the first. And they said they paid for those in 18 passes because they dropped their salt use by half.
That's impressive. I think you hit on a lot of great ways where there's actual savings there. And I appreciate some of the description of new technology. Kind of remind me of a food truck. I'm going to get the shake and bake, and then I'm going to wash it down with a slurry. That sounds really refreshing. And by the way, we're going to, melt and remove snow and ice in the same capacity as we're, hitting up that food truck. But no, Ed, we're going to, as we wrap up here, I do want to just state in general that, SIMA has also been active in the Wisconsin legislation, and you hit on, we have discussed kind of the main reasons why, and really I kind of look at the three main points, and that's, we support this kind of legislation because, one, it provides liability protection that's much needed for the private contractor. Two, it's voluntary. It's not mandatory. No one's forcing anybody to do this. If a company just does not want to participate, or they just maybe they don't have the clientele or the customer base that's needed, they don't have to. It's their decision to do so. And then three, Simon, we believe in continuing education and training, and that training and best practices lead to better results. And certainly appreciate our partnerships here with Allison, you, Wisconsin Saltwise, of course, Ted, the state of New Hampshire. I know some of our listeners hopefully have been to the New Hampshire Salt Symposium annually, which is just a great day of education and training. That's it's really sold out the last few years, so appreciate the partnership there. But with that, I do want to say thank you again to Allison and Ted that we spent some time today talking about salt applicator legislation. This is ongoing. It's active in Wisconsin now. I do think other states and provinces, we're seeing this in particular right now in Ontario, and seeing some interest in Minnesota and Illinois, amongst other places, that are looking at some type of a salt applicator legislation to protect freshwater sources. So thank you both, Ted and Allison, and hope to talk to you and see you soon.
Thanks, Martin. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Snow Talk. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Western & Fisher, and please join us for future episodes. Take care and have a safe winter.
Thanks for joining us for Snow Talk, sponsored by Western Snowplows. We hope you enjoyed it. Check out the latest episodes of Snow Talk, including any you may have missed, at www.sima.org/podcast.